Okay, there we go. Good morning, everyone. There is a quorum in the room, so I'd ask you to take your seats so we can get started. Okay, so declarations of interest. We're all interested. Good. Confirmation of minutes, too, from March 23rd, 2015. Carried. Communications, response to inquiries. Councillor Fleury.
Madam Chair, I have a couple of questions. I want to make sure I follow procedure. So what would be the procedure in this case?
You would need 2/3 of the committee to agree to lift this item.
So I have a question on staff response regarding the notice of violation. It relates to the timing we're giving in the response.
So are you moving to have this item lifted?
I am.
Okay, so members of committee, we need 2/3 of present voting to lift that item. Is that carried? Carried. Thank you. So we'll return to that. Item number 1 is Sam's update. I think there's a verbal presentation, so we'll hold that and return to it. Item number 2, status update, Community and Protective Services Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending the 9th of April 2015. Received. Item number 3, semi-annual performance report to Council Q2 and Q3 of 2014. Received. Item number 4, 2015 2015 Child Care Service Plan, a funding framework for families and their children accessing not-for-profit licensed child care. And there is a presentation, so we'll hold that item and return to it. Item number 5, Emergency Management Accreditation Program. Received? Received? Received. Thank you. Item number 6, Security and Emergency Management Branch Annual Update. Received? Received? Hold?
On item 4, we're getting a presentation.
Yes. Okay, so item 6, is that received?
Yeah.
Thank you. Item number 7, harmonization of rec fees, and there is a presentation, so we'll hold that item and return to it. So before we get started this morning, I just had a few things I wanted to speak with the committee about. First, and I think foremost, is to formally recognize Steve Karolakis, because this is his last meeting. I have to say, at Amalgamation, which is when I met Steve 14 years ago, he was the general manager of EPS, and I was the chair of EPS. And I would have to say that I think Steve has been my go-to person for pretty much every committee I've chaired in the 14 years since Amalgamation. So, I know it's a bit inside baseball, but I would say that things work best when there's a true partnership between the political leadership and the staff leadership. And it's not always that we agree at the start, but Steve always came around to my way of thinking. So it just works so very well. Really, Steve delivered Council's vision with care and expertise, and we all know how hugely helpful he has been to all of us. And he has been, just a true soldier for this corporation. And Steve, we just really miss you and wish you all the very best where life takes you next. Okay. I also want to start by taking a moment to thank councillors and councillors' assistants who attended the technical briefing on the 2015 Child Care Services Plan. It's a very complex file, and I'm sure that Community and Protective Services members will have lots of questions when this is on the agenda today. Also, on March 30th, I attended the launch of the Ottawa Museums and Archives Virtual Collections Catalog. The virtual catalog includes digitized records and artifacts from the city's archives, city museums, and community museums. Bytown Museum, Diefenbunker, Canada's Cold War Museum, Goulburn Museum, Museum Park Vanier, and the Osgood Township Museum. It's an amazing online tool that lets users easily discover the history of our city right at their fingertips. The catalog has more than 34,000 records active on the website, and it will continue to grow. I invite everyone to visit ottawa.ca to find out all the great hidden gems it has to offer. And And finally, you may have heard that next month the city will begin another exciting season of offering new food options to satisfy the appetites of residents and tourists. Building on the success of the 2013 Council-approved street food vending program, we've added 5 new vendors, 4 food trucks, and 1 cart. Join us on May 13th in Marion Dewar Plaza when we launch the food vending season and introduce these new food trucks and carts that will certainly complement our diverse mix of existing vendors. So now we'll turn to the first item on the agenda, which is the one that was lifted by Councillor Fleury. So, Councillor Fleury, over to you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. A couple of questions following the response. One of the points speaks of property owner demonstrating progress towards compliance as one of the elements for follow-up. I'd love more details on that, because we hear from the building code angle that a nail a year keeps you going. We don't need to see major progress, and I'd love for us to define what progress means in this.
Through you, Chair. So, as indicated in the response, in essence, the bylaw currently, as it stands, there's 19 calendar days, but there is discretion in certain areas. So, contractor availability, the time of year as work progresses, and some of the other issues. That said, whether there's health and safety or public safety issues, there's no discretion there for timelines. So, as we talked a little bit earlier, and I'd have to concur with legal services with regards to any other legislation that may override it. Certainly, the bylaw, the time frame, we could change that at your direction, and we could add that to our bylaw review, as long as there's no superior legislation that would prevent that. And we could concur, we could verify with legal services on that.
Yeah, so that's the following element is there's timelines that council established. I guess there's probably provincial guidelines regulating those. I'd love if you take, and I'm looking to my colleagues to confer if we can review those timelines. In certain cases, they're, in my mind, way too long. If it's not our authority at council, as a council to do so, is it possible to come back and inform us so that we can write to the ministers or to the department provincially for to request those changes?
Through you, Chair, absolutely. We'll go back with that staff direction. We'll do that verification for you, and then we'll advise either way if you want us to modify, if it's under our purview, simply, or if we need to coordinate with other legislative bodies.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? So received on the item? Okay. Turning then to item number 1 on the agenda, the Social Assistance Management System update. Dr. Burke.
Madam Chair, we don't actually have a presentation related to this morning. We did do an update following last committee meeting with respect to the information that was asked and requested. The key area that we did focus on is making sure that the financials, in terms of what we're anticipating going forward, are a little more clear. When we began the financials on this particular file, we were basing this on our experience that was happening in the November, December, early January period, in which case we were a very, very low success rate on processing claims. At this point, we're now into a typical average rate of between 85 and 90% a day. It still is not where we'd like it to be, but that does change some of our financials going forward. What we are anticipating is that we will be within the budget envelope. However, the budget envelope requires us to achieve a gapping target, in other words, a certain degree of staff turnover. We do not anticipate that we're going to be able to achieve that staff turnover this year, and that's what the projections are based on in terms of an additional approximately 1.4, 1.6 million for this year. We've also indicated what we've received to date from the province to help offset those costs, which would leave a balance at this point should we receive no additional funding from the province of about $1 million. As you know, both AMO, AMSA, various municipalities are all asking for compensation to the 100% level for these additional costs as a result of this. So I'll leave our comments at that and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Brockington?
I just wanted to ask you, Madam Chair, should we acknowledge on the public record that you did send a letter to the minister, and are we expecting, had there been like pre-discussions before that letter went out for the minister to come to Ottawa and sort of see see the issues in person?
We did. Dr. Burry and I did work on a letter. We did send a follow-up letter, as was directed by this committee, to the minister. We don't know that we have any intention of asking her to come back at this point, but I think we're good for now, and maybe we should just wait to see if there's another crisis looming, and then we would do it at that point.
Since that time, we have had the ministers, the staff of the ministry have been to Ottawa. In addition, we had the third-party advisor was here last week directly discussing our experiences, the experiences, and what's happening. I've also, through our association, AMSA, requested a direct discussion with a third-party advisor related to the work that Ottawa is helping to facilitate for the association, which is the recovery plans for the municipalities going forward once we get some stability in this system. So we're this week having the first basically province-wide statistics and information is being produced, so we get a sense of what's happening. The ministry is doing all the validation to ensure that information is correct, because we actually can't do it ourselves, and then from there to start building a recovery plan. The ministries itself, the messaging we're getting is that this is likely to continue for another 6-month period, which I find a bit disturbing in terms of that. But again, they're waiting for the advice of the third-party advisor, which now looks like somewhere towards the end of May.
Is it possible to attach your letter to the minutes of this committee?
We can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. So received on item number 1? Received. Thank you. Our next held item is the 2015 Child Care Services Plan, a funding framework for families and their children accessing not-for-profit licensed child care. Dr. Burry.
Just 1 second. I'm going to ask our speakers to join us. Tim Hiscott and the Francophone School Board. They're going to present the plan. Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This morning we're going to be presenting, which is essentially the culmination of approximately 2 years' work. In 2013, February of that year, Council approved a new modernization framework for childcare. What I'd like to do this morning, and what we have is we have some additional presenters who are actually going to present the plan, who are from our stakeholders reference group. To my left is Marilyn Ferguson. She's the Manager of Direct Operations, and she's responsible for ensuring that for the Child Care Modernization Project, she's going to present an overview. Beside her is Kim Hiscott from Andrew Flex Services, and Marianne Saucier from le Conseil des Écoles Publiques de l'Est de l'Ontario. Marianne is going to present in French this morning. And both of these individuals are members of the Stakeholders Reference Group. This is the group that Council approved to be set up to help oversee the development of the modernization recommendations. Before Marilyn begins, I do want to acknowledge the Stakeholders Reference Group as well as the child care community, and you'll notice that not a lot have come this morning because the feedback we've gotten is that largely they are very supportive, and I think, as you'll hear from the presentation, believe that this is the direction we should be going. Finally, I want to make sure that I do acknowledge some contributions of city staff who are actually with us as well today. One is Rachel Clark. She's the Manager of Child Care Services, as well as Stephanie Brodage, who's the Program Manager, and largely looks after all the various elements of the wait list and making sure that parents get access to care. The other individual that I want to make sure we acknowledge is also Colleen Hendricks, and Colleen is actually doing another forum this morning. Colleen has become, I would call her the Energizer Bunny in terms of external engagement. She is incredible in terms of what she brought together, and her group actually helped oversee quite the extensive external engagement around this entire report. So on that basis, I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn and to our stakeholder references members so they can walk through the elements of the report.
Good morning. Actually, I'm going to be the first person to speak. It's my pleasure to introduce a bit of the child care service plan to you. So first, to set the stage, there are just over 28,000 licensed child care spaces in the City of Ottawa, with the total number of subsidized spaces that were available for families that were eligible for a fee subsidy in 2014 of 6,470. But we also need to acknowledge that there were children on the waiting list who have been pre-approved and are waiting for a subsidized space in Ottawa, and that would be 3,242. Sorry, I'm trying to manage the slides and talk. No, I think I can do it. I just need to get coordinated. So the context of childcare and the early years sector has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. As we all know, the implementation of full-day kindergarten was the last group. The last 25% of schools were enjoying full-day kindergarten as of September 2014, and this did have an impact on the childcare sector. The slow rollout has definitely changed the sector significantly. The school's first policy, and I should say significantly in a positive way, I mean there's lots of positive reasons to be excited about full-day kindergarten. The school's first policy has resulted in an investment in school-based childcare by the province and increased childcare spaces by 3,200 spaces in our community for the children 0 to 3.8. Finally, we also anticipate that the new Child Care and Early Years Act, which is going to replace the old Day Nurseries Act, will come into force fully by fall of 2015. We've seen some of the proposed regulations, and we're waiting more information from the province. We're right now in the community consultation approach. But it is expected that the changes to the Act and the regulations will have a positive impact on our sector. So we first started thinking about what a new funding framework could look like for Ottawa at the Stakeholders Reference Group in the summer of 2013. And it was really important to us at that time that the city understood what was unique about childcare agencies and the challenges that we were facing in Ottawa. The members of the Stakeholders Reference Group would like to acknowledge that the city has adapted and changed the funding approach based on the feedback received from the Stakeholders Reference Group.
Bonjour. Merci de nous accueillir ici aujourd'hui. Alors, pour continuer avec la présentation, nous continuons à utiliser la version du cadre de modernisation approuvée par le Conseil au mois de février 2013. Et en 2014, nous avons continué de consulter l'ensemble de la communauté. Ces consultations avaient pour but d'obtenir des commentaires sur la transition, des listes d'attente et l'accès aux subventions, ainsi que sur le cadre de financement proposé aux subventions d'exploitation générale. Les parents demeurent impliqués grâce aux discussions de groupe et à leur représentation sur le groupe de référence des intervenants. Et à l'écoute des recommandations et des rétroactions, les membres du personnel envisagent la création d'un groupe consultatif de parents séparés pour l'année 2015. Alors voici les commentaires qui ont été reçus de la communauté lors des consultations de l'année 2014. La communauté propose un financement de base qui devrait être versé aux organismes pour couvrir les tarifs imposés aux parents. Il faut offrir du soutien aux organismes sans but lucratif fragilisés par le nouveau mode de financement. Le tarif de place subventionnée à plein tarif devait être le même. Et le financement doit couvrir l'ensemble des frais pour les enfants les plus jeunes, en particulier les nourrissons. La communauté nous a dit que le financement municipal en matière de santé et de sécurité devrait être distribué en fonction de la capacité autorisée de façon à mieux répondre aux besoins des services de garde. Et il faut conserver, voire bonifier, le financement des programmes destinés aux enfants autochtones, francophones, aux enfants ayant des besoins particuliers, ainsi qu'au programme Bon Départ. À la lueur de la rétroaction reçue de la communauté, le groupe de référence des intervenants soutient les 3 principes suivants face au cadre de financement. L'équité, par un financement octroyé en fonction de la capacité autorisée et une priorité accordée aux services de garde à but non lucratif. La transparence, c'est-à-dire le calcul d'un financement simple et prévisible. et l'adaptabilité par le financement qui répond aux priorités locales et aux lignes directrices provinciales.
So based on the principles agreed to over the course of our work in 2013 and 2014, objectives were established for the service plan and the funding framework. The key objectives to the plan will benefit all parents and children in licensed childcare, and they include increased parent access and choice for licensed not-for-profit childcare. They will stabilize fees and decrease wait times for families, maximize the number of subsidies, and prioritize children and families most in need, support providers and parents with system planning, and increase equity and transparency in funding to support sector stabilization.
Kim has already mentioned one key recommendation within the 2015 service plan. Some further highlights that have been incorporated in response to community feedback are that the city should only enter into contracts with for-profit providers when there is no nonprofit agency in the same area or a nonprofit willing to move into a geographic area. The community has indicated that we should maintain funding for specialized programs like Head Start programs, designation for Francophone and Aboriginal children, as well as services for children with special needs. The final recommendation from the community is that our fee subsidies should be maintained at $6,300 to ensure that we have sufficient funds within our system to permit our entire system in Ottawa to move to a floating subsidy that will allow parents increased choice in the location of their care. The total child care budget for 2015 is approximately $112 million, and the chart you see in front of you outlines the funding sources that will be used to implement the new funding framework outlined in the service plan if it's approved today. The new enhancement wage enhancement funds from the Ministry of Education are at $8.5 million. They will assist with wage stabilization for the sector. The general operating grant will be supported with a redirection of $14 million in provincial funds that were previously allocated to the old wage subsidy program. The additional $1 million comes from a core service delivery category from the province that it allows us some flexibility. Staff are recommending that the Child Care Reserve Fund be used to fund the stabilization initiative that's been outlined in the plan, in addition to the Municipal Health and Safety Program for the years of 2016 to 2020. And as you know, the funding for 2015 for health and safety has already been allocated through the budget process. So what's before you today as a policy within the Child Care Service Plan is the General Operating Grant. And the purpose is to support the costs of operating licensed child care programs so that we can reduce wait times in the community, reduce parent fees for child care, and stabilize the service levels of care available to parents. Wherever possible and where funds allow, we're also focused on improving access to high-quality, affordable early learning and child care services in our community. And we propose to do this with a general operating grant that looks at two components: a base component that will be allocated based on licensed capacity and weighted for the age group of children served, as well as a government priority category that will focus on the number of children who are receiving a fee subsidy and allocate funds accordingly. The stabilization initiative has been designed to provide transitional funding for child care agencies that may experience a reduction in total government funding due to the new funding framework. The intent of offering this support over a 5-year period is to allow agencies in this community sufficient time to adapt and stabilize, while at the same time maintaining the current level of access to child care for parents in our communities. There are two key envelopes of funding associated with the stabilization. They are the Emergency Bridge Fund, and these are funded from operating provincial dollars, and the annual transition support that is designated to be allocated from the Child Care Reserve Fund, and that's the $7.75 million you saw on a previous slide. The principal recommendation before you today is the approval of the 2015 Child Care Service Plan. It includes the policies that we've outlined related to the general operating grant and stabilization, as well as the allocation of $11.5 million from the Child Care Reserve to support the implementation of the plan. This plan, or the general operating grant, must be in place by the end of 2015 if we are to meet our provincial guidelines. The plan introduces a new concept. For the first time, funding will be allocated to the child per licensed space. This is designated to reduce the cost of care to parents and to lower wait times. The plan provides a transition over 5 years that allows the province time to adjust its funding to achieve our local goal of stable and equitable funding across the sector. A key element here, and it's the last recommendation, is that to be compliant with the funding guidelines, the city must fund its directly operated programs in the same manner as community programs. This will give us sufficient time to clearly identify the ongoing municipal investment that will be required for the city's directly operated programs. And with that, I will turn it back over to Aaron.
Thanks, Marlon. I want to thank our presenters, Kim and Marianne, for coming this morning to sort of outline this on behalf of the Stakeholders Reference Group. Essentially, we know that this is a complicated subject, so we do expect there to be some questions. We have tried to simplify this as much as possible through this process, and I think in the end of 5 years, we'll have something that will be a lot easier to describe to parents and families as to how this system actually works. So on that basis, we'll turn it over to the committee for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Burry, and thank you to all of our presenters this morning. Before we take questions from committee members, there is one member of the or two members of the public now that would like to speak. So we'll call the first one, Alex Cullen, and on deck is Christine Spardella. Good morning, Mr. Cullen. Now, I know that you, of all people, are familiar with the Cullen Rule. So you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
It used to be 10. Just want you to know that. Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Alex Cullen. I'm the chair of the board of River Parkway Children's Center and River Heights Children's Center, which is a licensed nonprofit childcare agency within the City of Ottawa. River Parkway is located at 40 Cleary Avenue on the Unitarian Congregation campus near Westboro. It serves 70 children from toddler to school age. River Heights is located in Sir Wilfrid Laurier High School on 10th Line Road in Orleans. Serves 30 children from toddler to now preschool. I'm here to speak to the city's 2015 Child Care Service Plan. My executive director and I did attend the briefing session on the service plan held by city staff at the Nepean Sportsplex last week. I'd like to thank city staff for their understanding and patience in helping us through this new service plan. The first thing to note is that child care, particularly licensed child care, is an important service in our community. The City of Ottawa has over 100,000 children aged 10 and under, the overwhelming majority living in families where both parents work. Therefore, for these families, good child care is essential. Yet only 1/4 of these children have access to licensed child care spaces. What differentiates licensed child care from unlicensed child care is that licensed child care is provided by trained professionals in supervised locations following a prescribed early childhood education program. As you know, there's a significant waiting list for licensed child care in Ottawa. I think the slide showed 3,000 for subsidized spaces. There's an additional 9,000 for licensed spaces. As you also know, the child care in Ottawa has been in a state of flux, in large part by the introduction of full-day learning by the provincial government. Indeed, last year's City of Ottawa Child Care Service Plan, that you folks approved, bluntly forecasted that some child care centres would be forced to close as a result, and unfortunately this has happened. As well, 5 years after the government introduced full-day learning in Ontario schools, we finally have a transition plan here in the city in this year's Child Care Service Plan. We are grateful to see it. The plan calls for this council to approve an $11.5 million drawdown of the Child Care Reserve Fund over the next 5 years to accommodate a number of changes in the city's funding formula, to permit Ottawa's 333 licensed child care providers to adjust to the new funding regime, weighted by age group, stabilize fees, adjust to the new allocation of subsidized spaces for low-income families, from center-based to child-based, and meet the council's priorities for children with special needs, Aboriginal and Francophone children. The report does make clear there will be winners and losers under the new funding arrangement. The estimate is approximately 50-50, which justifies using these funds from the Child Care Reserve to transition these agencies who would lose out under the new funding formula. At our centre, we're not sure where we fit in, and we'll be finding out with all the others later this year. While we appreciate there will be transition funds for those centres losing revenue as a result of the new city funding formula, the old funding formula was unarguably rife with inequities. The question remains, what happens when the transition funding ends in 5 years? Perhaps by then there will be a new federal funding formula. One can only hope. There is, however, one aspect to this year's Child Care Service Plan that needs further thought, and that has to do with the relationship of the city and the school boards regarding the provision of child care spaces. Last year's plan said explicitly, and I quote, "The city as a delivery agent will review school board proposals and incorporate these proposals in a citywide plan for the allocation of program services and resources, provide a seamless transition for children between community-based child care providers and the school system." Also said there's an expectation that school boards submit plans to the city as CMSM for approval. This only makes sense. The school board can now provide more than full-day learning programs for kindergarten-age children. They're now permitted to provide preschool and toddler childcare programs. Indeed, the Ottawa Catholic School Board is on track to provide 270 new preschool childcare spaces in 10 schools in our city. Therefore, it is surprising to read in Appendix A of the service plan before you today the statement by the General Manager of Community and Social Services, I quote, "The City of Ottawa is not interested in pursuing an expanded role in system planning with school boards," as in this at the end, school boards. Well, I can understand that often provincial policy initiatives can lead to resource pressures on local governments, and I'm sympathetic to the challenges these create. The city is still the child care service delivery manager, and many of us in the child care community do expect collaboration and cooperation between the city and school boards as the child care services change and expand within our community. Turning a blind eye to what school boards are doing would not meet the intent of the 2014 service plan you folks approved, providing for a seamless transition for children between community-based child care providers and the school system. We believe the city should use its leadership role in child care service planning and engage the school boards as part of overall planning. Finally, the last thing, Madam Chair, the one thing missing from this child care service plan is any mention of advocacy for expanded child care funding from senior levels of government to make child care programs more accessible to families. Your staff in this child care service plan acknowledges that community-based child care cannot function on its own and requires government support, despite the fact that the demand for regulated child care is strong and increasing in our community. We believe the city has an important role to play here in advocating for expanded child care, including the affordability issue. The 6,500 subsidized spaces Ottawa has does not cover all low-income families that require the support and is inaccessible to middle-income families. Many families can't afford the quality child care that licensed agencies provide. The city has a well-established advocacy role in partnership with the housing community in Ottawa, should be developing the same relationship with the child care community. Families and children who need this care deserve no less. Thank you, Madam Chair. Questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohen. Any questions for the delegation? Seeing none, we'll move to our next delegation. Christine Spardella. Good morning.
Good morning.
You have 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak this morning. My name is Christine Spardella, and I represent Hawthorne Meadows Nursery School, Inc. We offer 3 programs in Ottawa's southeast area, 2 of which, Diane, fall under your ward. So it's Cornerstone Children's Centre, Hetherington Nursery School, and Hawthorne Meadows Nursery School. So at Cornerstone Children's Centre, there's 55 spaces, 15 toddlers, 40 preschoolers. At Hawthorne Meadows, there's 24 preschoolers, and at Hetherington Nursery School, there's 32 preschoolers. I've been asked to come here today by my board of directors because they do have some concerns, more questions regarding the child care service plan. We acknowledge that the SRG and the city have done an incredible amount of work, and that we do believe that it's all been done within the best interests of the families and children in the city. But the main issues that my board have, plainly, is the vagueness, and the vagueness of how it's going to impact centers in the city, and particularly ours. So, for example, we are a part of the Ottawa Carleton Head Start Association for preschoolers, of which there are 10 schools in Ottawa, and they are mentioned in the service plan in a paragraph, but there's no indication of how that is going to affect our funding or not affect our funding, or how that indicates issues for the GOG or not with us. One of the main issues for us as well is staff retention. Since the school boards have become our direct competitors, we cannot compete with their wages. If there's a force of changes with the GOG for staff salaries, then retention for us will be next to impossible, we fear, and then it will be very difficult to offer a quality program to the children and families that we do service. So sitting before you as an employee of these centers, it feels self-serving to bringing up salaries, but the fact is that it's known fact that childcare staff are predominantly low paid, and if wages are changed, then there's no reason for them to stay. And then to run a program without quality staff isn't going to happen. Our board members are also fearful that with this new child care service plan, that the full fee families will be then put into having 3 choices: unlicensed child care, nannies, and for-profit centers. And many of our board members and some of our families have chosen specifically not to deal with for-profit centers for whatever their personal reason. They do believe that nonprofit offers a quality that they would like to see offered throughout the city for all of the Ottawa's children. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I don't do this on a regular basis. So I do have all these notes that I'm not following very well. Councillor Deans, you did mention yesterday on the CBC radio show All in a Day that the real changes will be apparent in over 5 years, and that the child care community will have to modernize. But we don't really know what that means. So it's, again, an area of vagueness where we're more than willing to work with the city, we're more than willing to do what's best for Ottawa's families and children, but we're not really clear what those expectations are for us. I think that's really all I have to say today. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for being here. Any questions to the delegation? Seeing none, thank you. We are going to go to questions to staff now, but before we do, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One is I think staff and the people who contributed to this report have done an amazing job. I mean, this is a complex issue, and it's a thorny issue, and it's a difficult one to really try and get a go-forward plan that makes sense. And I think out of all of that, you've done an amazing job. You've put in place a stabilization plan for the next 5 years. You've put floating subsidies, given more choice for families and parents. And I think ultimately the work that you have done is the right direction. So congratulations on that. We did hear from some delegations that there's still vagueness in the system, and there's still concern about what it all means and how they are going to have input going forward. So I'm wondering if you could answer the questions and the concerns that were raised by the delegations.
Madam Chair, as a result of the complexity that you have, as well as the number of agencies and arrangements that we have, the concerns or interest in this needs to be done on a very individual basis. So that is the next step. We'll be meeting with all of the agencies, walking through the funding formulas, having discussions with them, as well as understanding where they are. With respect to Head Start programs, which were mentioned, we specifically indicated, and the Head Start programs are not included in the provincial funding formulas. They're 100% funded by the municipality. because the province does not recognize Head Start programs in this particular jurisdiction. They don't recognize them in Ontario. So there are elements of our funding which are within the jurisdiction of this committee. They're 100% municipal investments, and that's where you approve those as part of the annual budget cycles that come forward. But I think the key point is that we're going to meet with each individual agency, walk them through this, because then the next part of this is each agency that would potentially see some reduction in government funding down the road. We'll be looking at what we would refer to as a viability and sustainability plan with them. We're putting together an expert panel that will start looking at how it can work with those agencies. So this is very much not something that's going to happen the next year. There was no change in funding in 2016. So we're going to balance 2015, no change, 2016, no change. So those agencies have a degree of stability while we work through, on an individual basis, what it actually means for them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burry. Our first question is from Councillor Eglai.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to tell you how I think it's going to work, and you tell me if I've understood correctly. So right now, if I'm a parent with a child, and I qualify, or my child qualifies for subsidy, I have to find a daycare space that is already subsidized and apply to that center, correct?
Essentially, yes. You have to find unused money in the system somewhere.
Right. With the change, my child will actually have the subsidy, and I can go to any number of daycare providers?
Where we will be in the early stages of this is what I would refer to euphemistically as a controlled float. What we're actually doing at the city is we know where the vacancies are. We know where, and we'll be moving into essentially a system of placement. So there will not be unlimited options, but we're going to help families directly place to spaces that we know are vacant and that will be vacant. So much more of a controlled placement at this point. Where you can move to full floating and where there are municipalities who have full floating are those where the demand for childcare pretty well meets the supply. Our issue is that we have a much higher demand than we have supply, so you can give individuals choice, but with that tightness in the market, you actually have to control and make sure that there are spaces available for them to go to. So that's essentially, rather than floating where the parent is trying to find where the money is unallocated, in this particular case, we're going to be contracting for the spaces and making sure that they're available to parents.
So parents and families will have more choice than they have now, but not complete choice. Is that a...
They have the choice that is available. The other area that we're really heavily focused on is because of the way the system is currently structured, we have about 40% of parents who have into the city requesting a transfer, meaning they have found a space, but it is not ideally located for them. There are several areas out of jurisdiction. It's very inconvenient for them. This creates an awful lot of extra work in terms of just trying to figure out how to transfer parents. We're going to try, what we're intending to do is manage that. We've been doing this now on a small scale with about 200 spaces, and it's been working much better. We're actually able to place parents much faster. The other element that is different is that prior to all the work we've done in the last year is essentially parents had to find the space, then come to see the city if they were eligible, then we had to figure out how much we were going to pay the diet shake. It was a very convoluted system. The parents now are essentially pre-approved and they're on a list. So as soon as the space becomes available, they can see in the system that it's available and the placements can happen much more rapidly. That's our intent. That's where we want to go.
Okay. One of the questions that flows from that is one of the complaints I've got from a number of parents is geographically driven. You know, there's a space, but I live in Craig Henry and the space is in Orleans or whatever. Maybe not that extreme, but and it makes it difficult for me to drop my other kids at school, get to work on time, all those things. So is this system going to give any kind of priority to families based on their geographic area?
So essentially, yes, because what they're going to be doing is we have placement staff who are going to be looking at what the priorities are and then looking to match the most in priority with the spaces that are available. So there's an awful lot of coordination that goes on in the early years. What we're hoping to do and what we would see is that as supply and demand, hopefully through a great deal of federal and provincial expansion in the next decade, then we won't need to be as heavily engaged in that. This will happen more naturally than it does now. Currently, we're going to plan this going forward, and that's what we are doing. We are matching locations that suit parents' needs rather than them having to go out and try and find where this is and then try and apply for subsidy.
And with this more floating approach, does that going to have any kind of an impact on the percentages at a center? In other words, the number of subsidized spaces versus full fee paying parents. And again, going back to the geographic question, how do you prioritize that if you have a full fee paying parent that lives 3 blocks from the center and you have somebody who's on a subsidy that maybe lives further out? Who gets in, and how is that decision made?
There has to be we have to obviously ensure that children who are subsidized get the same equitable access as those who are full fee. In full fee system, and particularly the way that this has been built as a government priority, is to ensure that subsidized children also get access. In a system where you have wait lists, it's very easy for full fee paying parents to dominate the system, which has been problems in other areas. That's why we've brought in an incentive around ensuring that subsidized children also have equitable access. I think the issue that you may be leaning towards is specific to municipal centers in terms of how do you determine the proportion of subsidies in municipal services. Municipal services were set up for subsidized children. That was the intent. What we've seen is that with the demand for full fee paying care, and particularly in the area of Huron, when we built a brand new center, full fee paying parents are trying to essentially ask to be put at the top of the priority list or more priority. Those centers, and essentially the policy of the city was to essentially establish centers in areas where no not-for-profit or for-profit would establish. And clearly Huron was one of those areas originally. When you build a new center, particularly one that we invested in to the extent of Huron, it is very popular with full fee paying parents. We understand that, but internally our job is to make sure that subsidized children from the Huron area make sure that they receive the care and subsidized, because there aren't other not-for-profit providers in that particular area.
So in short, to use Huron as the example, if you had 100% of the children were in need of a subsidy, then Huron would be 100% full with subsidized kids.
That's essentially what you'd be looking at if that's an unmet need. And typically what we have done is allow for some full fee paying parents in our subsidized programs. Depending on the area and the level of the facility, in Lower Town, for example, it's 100% subsidized children. It's performing as it was originally intended. As neighborhoods undergo regentrification and change, what we're seeing, and this is why as part of the recommendations we're talking about bringing back a municipal review. Do we in fact continue to meet those original directives that were given to staff in terms of establishing centers in communities where there was no other option versus where are we today? And certainly we operate a center in Canada. We operate them in different parts of the downtown area. What is the percentage of full fee versus subsidized? If we're no longer able to address the needs of subsidized children, then should we be looking as a municipality as of establishing in other underserved communities, for example, as a question?
So the short, and this will be my last question. So the short answer then is if you had a subsidized child applying for a vacancy and you had a full fee paying parent applying for a subsidy, not subsidy, but a vacancy at the same location, and there was only one vacancy, it would go, and it was city-run, it would go to the subsidized child over the full fee-paying parent, regardless of geography.
Essentially, yes, because those programs were established to ensure, because, again, otherwise you also get parents full fee coming in from outside that community, and they will displace subsidized children.
And the new system there'll be no change in that?
No, we're essentially going to balance, because essentially what we're looking at there is identifying now more on an agency-by-agency basis where are the subsidized spots that meet the geographic demand based on what we're seeing from wait lists for subsidy, and trying to balance that with full fee-paying parents. And the reality in the system is that we make up, in terms of subsidy, about 25% in decreasing of that system. The majority of it is full fee-paying parents, and as I think you indicated, our own numbers look at weights of in between 6,000 and 9,000 parents who are now competing basically for the 3,000 we have in terms of subsidized care.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Egli. Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a series of questions which I think are actually a useful follow-on from Councillor Egli's comments. First, mostly about demographics, and I'm looking at page 8 of the actual plan. Looking at the table 1 there, where we see the 12,280 children who are on the wait list, do you have a sense as to what percentage of those are in the 0 to 4 age category? Would that be the preponderance?
We'd have to give you a detailed breakdown. The majority of them would be in the 0 to 4 category, but there are within that as well, when you get into the 4, 5, and above, some of them that are waitlisted on before and after school programs in the school board system.
So looking at, one of the statistics that surprised me was the total number of children awaiting a full fee space, 9,000, which suggested to me, and maybe I have this wrong, but that we have a supply problem, that even though these are families that are prepared to pay full fee, there are reasons why the market is not providing spaces for them. Do you understand what those market forces are that are stopping potential entrepreneurs from opening up daycare centers?
So I'll take it, and Kim may help because she's a daycare operator as well. But in terms of the key elements of this is early learning entered into a degree of instability and confusion into the system. If you're a daycare investor or someone looking to even establish a not-for-profit, you don't even understand what portion of children you're going to be serving and for how long. The second key piece of this report, and this is based on our own review of the financials, is that today, in order to provide a quality licensed product, if you'd like, or a licensed service, it is not possible to do that without government subsidy. While there are parents waiting, they're waiting for a space that's within a certain fee range. Fees have largely hit the maximum. Without some degree of government subsidy, particularly in the 0 and 4, that market will not take those services. So it's a delicate balance. But certainly in the early years, this created tremendous confusion. We are seeing growth. You're seeing more licensed spaces. But what we also don't want to see is the trend we've been seeing, which is while they are operating and their programs are full, there's a certain max that parents are prepared to pay, and that is not lining up with the expenses of a government-regulated program, and those programs are actually, even well-established ones, are eating into their reserves, and that's why we've seen closures in the last year, is because they do not have sufficient government funding per space in order to remain viable.
So
Tim, did I hit it?
Sorry. So given that it's not an option for parents to do nothing while they're on the wait list, presumably the families that have the means to do so are finding alternative unlicensed or nannies or other forms of childcare. What about the families that are awaiting subsidized spaces? In this case, it looks like 3,242, which I presume is on top of the 6,300, which are already receiving subsidies. So a total of getting close to 10,000 children. But the 3,000 who are waiting, do you have a sense of what's happening for the families in that situation?
We do have a sense from the perspective this is not a desirable state. the primary or those individuals who are at the top of our waiting list are going to be those individuals who need childcare in order to continue their education or to get basic education, and in addition to that, to actually be able to work. So this generally is not where you'd want to be in terms of your social assistance and other programs. It means individuals may stay on those programs longer because you don't have this service to be able to connect it to. There is a tremendous amount of informal, which we use through our social services stream. We have the ability to purchase some informal childcare to assist with these. This is outside of that system, not our desired outcome in most cases, but parents do use a combination of families, relatives. They just may not be able to achieve the kind of employment status that they need. We may not be able to help them get into a better paying job because we can't provide the childcare. So those are the things which we are trying to line up from an integrated service in behinds, notwithstanding for the province and SAMS, but those are the elements that we're trying to do, and that's why I think it's important to have this discussion. These types of numbers are not uncommon across the province of Ontario, and it speaks to a system that was largely stagnated in the 90s and didn't grow for many, many years. Now what we are trying to do is catch up, but we're not getting the levels of funding from the other two levels of government to be able to provide this funding per space that would allow the system to grow to the levels required.
My last question is related to the application form. I've heard from a few parents who have complained to me that the form is very complicated. You spoke about complexity, and I'm just wondering whether that's a sentiment you've heard from other parents, and if there are any steps being taken to either simplify the application form or provide some sort of assistance to families who are struggling with getting through it.
We do provide assistance to anyone who needs to, with that in terms of doing the forms. We operate through 4 centers. We will do direct one-on-one with parents. The other issue that we've been working through with the vendor and supplier of our system is that the majority of parents have indicated to us that they would like to have something that they can actually work on and do on their phone as opposed to an application. So some of the concerns or complaints we get are related to people attempting to use the application on a phone, and it is more complicated and not constructed that way. But our vendor is looking to bring out within the next year to 2 a phone-based application designed for that. That should make this easier to work with. We did put a lot of emphasis on the application up front. The older system of where once you found subsidy, then you came to the city to fill out the application, while that may have they got a lot more assistance in terms of filling out the application process. What it did do on the other end is it really lengthened the time before we got them into subsidy. So this is putting the work up front. We recognize there's a bit of upfront pain in terms of getting that application done, getting the assessment, getting the documents, but the balance is that once that's completed, the placement process can be much faster to getting that choice done.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Nussbaum. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we have statistics on, since the early learning program began in 2010, what the net difference is between the number of childcare positions that are offered in the city? Are we collecting those types of statistics? Because we've seen childcare centers close. I'm just wondering what the net effect is.
The system has actually grown during the same period of time. The issue is more related to what are you don't want to see a system where you're losing spaces that you still need. And this has partly been why this, again, report has been structured in such a way to provide the financial assistance. We're seeing even programs that have existed for many years, we're seeing that tension in their financial statements. In other words, they're starting to eat into the reserves. Generally, childcares are required to have a minimum of 90 days full operating dollars. When we see them eating into that, we know that essentially their operations year over year are not meeting the expenses and costs. There are other programs where, keep in mind, early learning removed the 4- and 5-year-olds. Some of the programs were very specific, involved in that area, and it means a shift to lower age groups. Some programs chose not to do the investments that are required. We do have dollars that we got from the province that we offer out to agencies to do that kind of reconfiguration and investment. In some instances, it just is not viable for them to continue, or they're making a decision to exit the service.
And how frank have discussions been between the city and local service providers about the need to be cognizant of the changing landscape, how they need to evolve, how they need to be aware of these very, specific changes that are coming? Do we draw the line at some point, or do you have those very open discussions that you need to look at your model, you need to consider X, Y, Z?
I think what we're seeing is that the child care providers themselves are arriving at that point. What we are doing through the department and through our efforts through new advisory committee as well as investments is to help agencies make that transition from years of where they could potentially rely on government essentially assisting to one where they will have to adapt more to what are the changes in the market. Serving the younger age groups is certainly more challenging. Parents certainly have a greater degree of specificity in terms of what they're looking for. So we will be having those conversations with those agencies, specifically those that would require ongoing government funding beyond what's available from the province. There are a variety of reasons for that, and certainly what we are looking at is, particularly in certain segments of the city, the key trend that we spoke to last week at the technical briefing is around, for many years, there were certain programs that could benefit from literally paying no rent. They were sponsored through their government agency, they were sponsored through their church. Those days are over. And what we're seeing now is agencies are coming in and saying, oh, I now have to pay $200,000 a year for space. That's something we've never had to face before, and then we've looked at our parental fees. We can't put what are we going to do? That's essentially the kind of discussion we will have. There's others that are looking at redeveloping their existing properties or looking at potential relocations, partnerships with developers. That's the kind of discussion we will facilitate over the next 4 to 5 years so that those programs that need to transition can have a plan and put that in place and start that transition. We also receive funding from the province from time to time around these transition, and we make those dollars available to help fund the business plans, fund the legal costs or anything else related, moving costs. Those types of things are all eligible for those provincial funds that we receive and then distribute to the community.
Thank you. My final question, and if staff needs some time to consider it, I don't expect an answer today, but it was raised by one of the delegations about further advocacy, and I was wondering if our own staff could provide some ideas or options on how the city can further advocate with the provincial government and federal government. I know some things might be more obvious than others, but if staff could perhaps summarize how we can be more engaged and specifically where to focus on provincially and federally, I'd appreciate that.
We will and begun that discussion, some very preliminary discussions with Chair Deans around this notion. Keep in mind, and one of the reasons that we have structured the report and the information that we've brought to you is to ensure that we maintain our legislative requirement, which is to act in the provincial interest. That is now a legislative requirement for us to do. So our report is this entire proposal that you have in front of you is essentially on your basis will be sent to the province for ratification. We're here with a report that represents the provincial interest. I think when you look at lobbying, advocacy, and other pieces, that's a separate piece, and we've begun having that conversation with Chair Deans to bring that back to committee as to what are the avenues that we actually do that through the official political channels, particularly through AMO, AMSA, the other types of organizations that are involved with the issue, and then how does council take on that particular view. So, Chair Deans, if I've overstepped my bounds, you can let me know.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Kadri.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Dr. Berry, just a couple of small questions. One is, In terms of vulnerable child that you identified or in your speaking notes, what constitutes a vulnerable child? And secondly, what is the wait timeline for that individual or for that child or for that family in this process?
So in terms of vulnerable children, we had an expert panel that essentially established criteria around how individuals coming in will be waitlisted or prioritized for placement into subsidy. And there's certain levels of criteria that are around that. Some of the basic concepts would be a child who's, they provided them here for me. So essentially, the financial eligibility pieces of it are things like if the parent is in receipt of social assistance, either Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Programs. Families living between the low-income cutoff within the province of Ontario. Families earning between $20,000 and $40,000 net, and then families earning more than $40,000. So I'm giving you sort of a degradation in terms of how the priorities would be set up. In terms of employment activity, so again, order of priority, social assistance recipients who are exiting Ontario Works ODSP for employment, social assistance recipients with eligible participation agreements, families with a former child care subsidy, et cetera. You can see that they're all graded based on those, because essentially we would have no child wait if there were sufficient dollars coming in from the province. When you don't, you have to come up with some degree of how you're going to managing it. Studying and training, this was a key one for us, is around the whole priority of completing high school. If you've not completed high school and you're a parent of a child, the likelihood of the financial future for that family is minimal. You look at equivalency of foreign credentials. That's part where we have foreign individuals coming into the country who are looking to achieve their equivalency. During that period, if they do not have child care, they can't achieve that equivalency, and therefore the family's financial needs. There's a whole series of these that are set up in terms of that priority. We can certainly send the full thing to your office so you have a view. So that's essentially how the priority is done. In terms of those on the wait list, it really depends on when the service becomes available. In certain areas of the city, it may be rapid. We're doing placements, for example, of infants that come in on emergency placement. We are often asked to do that. That's relatively short term, and we turn those around. Others may have to wait because essentially when child care system and the way it's set up is typically it's going to be pretty much full by the beginning of September. You have another openings in January. We're now getting into some openings. It's not, once the space is filled, it's not likely to be vacated for some time.
Thank you very much for that response, Mr. Burry. And the second question is about fairness. In terms of in this process, reading the report and stuff, what I seem to get is that a subsidized child has advantage over a non-subsidized family or children. Is that your reading on the program also, or am I mistaken?
No, I don't see that a subsidized child does have an advantage. What we've basically done is to ensure that within our 6,300 spaces out of the 28,000, that we make sure that those 6,300 get placed. And again, out of the 6,300, we have a wait list for those that's approximately equivalent. If you look on both sides, we have about 3,000, give or take, subsidized. We have about 9,000 full fee paying parents. If you look at the total number of spaces, it's roughly equivalent in that 25%. So we're trying to make sure that we don't create the alternative, which is full fee. We are simply unable to place the 6,300, and we're giving incentive around meeting those government priorities. Around infants, we are also going to be the number one provider in that, or the number one. We have more requirement to place infants on the subsidized side proportionally than on the full fee side, because on the full fee side you have things like full year maternity benefit that we do not have on the low income side. Essentially those parents have children and they need childcare virtually immediately. That's why we're putting more emphasis in terms of the infant side.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Kadri. Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. I just wonder when early learning was first introduced by the province, whether we agreed with it or not, or thought it was going to be a panacea or not in terms of our wait list, I just wonder if, and I understand that you can't compare space for space because what happened with early learning in terms of the beginning of the day and the end of the day in spots, but When I look at the number of kids in our community, both, from full fee paying parents or subsidized, on a wait list at 12,000 or just over 12,000, it's actually a bit astounding. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of the success of early learning. Did we gain anything from it, or are we just filling a bit of an empty bucket here?
So one of the things with respect to wait lists and understanding them is when we say there are 12,000, for example, waiting, they're not all waiting today. There is a period of essentially 6 months where most of them are indicating when their preference for care would be and when they would start it. There is a very high demand for licensed childcare. But at the same time, there are still vacancies that come up in the system, and we're filling those as quickly and as immediately as we can. What the province has essentially done on essentially the province is moving to essentially a universal system. So previously there would have been wait lists around 4- and 5-year-old half-day childcare. By the province moving that to universal, it's essentially now universal for all parents. Where we have some issues are in the before and after care, because those are not part of that program. They're funded in additionally. But those are funded now pretty much directly through by the province, and the school boards are largely meeting those demands. They're growing that area. The next area of focus really for the province needs to be in this 0 to 4. If it's to achieve its objectives, and that's why we want it to be very clear, here is how much dollars per space you're actually providing to the sector. Here's how they're operating. Here's what the wages are. And in addition, here's who's waiting for care. What we have seen with this type of very clear information is the province has been responding with additional funding coming into the municipality, because they're shifting it from areas in the province where they essentially either have low or no wait lists or they have extra funds. They're disproportionately funded versus us, which we had argued for over several years. So we're now seeing more funding coming in on the basis of the clarity, as well as we would encourage other municipalities and are to look at similar things which they are doing, so now the province can respond to make sure that this provincially funded system is appropriately funded.
So if I understand then, if I'm a full fee paying parent and I've got a 4 or 5-year-old, I'm doing okay. I can find a spot. But if I'm a low-income parent who's got an infant or needs that before and after care, are those? I guess for me, when I look at this, I just don't see that the province has given us a successful model here, because I don't see that the number on our wait list, our subsidized wait list, has gone down. So I go back to what Councillor Brockington said. The need for advocacy with the province is so important right now. I mean, we've got over 3,000 kids still waiting, or families still waiting. So we have floating spaces, and I understand that the move to that model, but in the end, it's your demand so far outstrips the supply that I just wonder what the plan is. And it may not be our plan, because I understand that we're operating within a box, but what is the province's plan for making sure that kids get good quality and affordable child care in this province?
If you look at their intent of their guidelines, which say they are there to provide stability and to improve access, they have set for themselves some very high standards of what they're trying to achieve. I think our job is to show them, which I think this plan does, and our reporting mechanisms will do, that here are your objectives, but there's a funding gap here that is not achieving what you've set out to achieve. The second piece of this is definitely related to licensure and expansion of programs. The province has not provided new capital to the cities. The school boards are getting new capital. They're getting dollars to create this. They have a schools first policy. That funding and that design is happening directly. That's where we've seen 3,200 new spaces develop in the school board that are licensed childcare on the basis of that provincial funding. That is where we believe, because again, it is the ministry's responsibility of education to ensure the system works properly. Our job is to administer their program and to maintain their interest. I think what we've indicated to them pretty clearly through this is, you've indicated this is what your interest is, and it's not quite there on the target.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fleury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quelques questions à Ewan. On a couvert quand même une bonne panoplie, puis quelques-uns de mes groupes étaient à la séance, donc j'ai entendu quelques questions. Suite aux discussions qu'on a eues, je me questionne sur quelques éléments. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on fait la transition de 5 ans? Je comprends l'idée qu'on va avoir un groupe qui change de processus, puis dans 5 ans, il y a un turnover complet. Mais je suis pas sûr que on fait seulement repousser le Band-Aid. Moi, je crois que la position, ce qu'on amène, c'est une solution qui devrait offrir un meilleur système. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne l'offre pas dans la prochaine année ou dans les prochains 18 mois? C'est pas clair pour moi dans ce qui était proposé.
Pour nous, tout ce qu'on avait vu dans la communauté, certainement pour certaines agences, si on enlève le Band-Aid, comme tu as mentionné tantôt, il y aura plus de fermeture ou perte de place dans notre région. Donc, ça aussi permet de temps d'avoir une conversation avec les agences qui ont besoin de faire un changement de la façon qu'ils livrent leurs services. Et certainement, s'ils sont obligés de changer de locaux, par exemple, ça prend du temps de faire une bonne planification de ces résultats. Et nous, on avait vu un max de 5 ans parce que notre plan, c'est sur le premier objectif, c'est si la province ne donne aucune nouvelle argent, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire maintenant? Donc, la plan a été créée sur le point de vue qu'il n'y ait pas d'augmentation au niveau de provincial. J'espère que ce n'est pas correct. Et si la province commence d'augmenter le niveau de financement, nos plans de 5 ans, on aura besoin moins de la réserve pour financer le plan.
So, I mean, I get that risk that you're describing. I don't want any organization to go under. They're offering services. They're helping our families right now. I do wonder, though, if that we could adjust that 5-year depending on exactly what you've described, increases, decreases in terms of funding, because to me we should get their strategic plans, their boards, to adjust their model. I mean, it doesn't take 5 years. You can do a university degrees during that period. So a strat plan within 3 years, we ask them to come back to the city with a revised plan, and we go from there to see if within a 3-year period they've adjusted their model.
I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And keep in mind, we're going to bring back an annual service plan each year that will provide updates with respect to that. At this point, there are 2 things that the province has done. Number one is previously we had a very limited relationship with agencies that provided subsidized care. They've now expanded to the entire system. It's going to take our staff some time to meet with all of those long-term, all of those providers, make sure we have the appropriate contracts. We're changing all their contracts, all their funding. The agencies need some time to digest this, and I would agree there are areas of the city where they may look at some very different strategic planning, but that's also going to take time, and particularly if you're in a neighborhood where some degree of relocating is involved. That is often a 2 to 3 year process if you're looking at either selling existing property or leaving, moving to a new one. We'll also become, for this particular group, more sensitive around the 0 to 4 when agencies move locations. What we've seen is that if you're going to move locations and you move outside of a very limited parameter, that has a tremendous impact on programs. You would think that a kilometer would not make that much difference. We've seen programs turn into financial difficulty because not all the parents go. It's a completely different marketing. They all of a sudden don't have the market they thought they were going to have to come to their program. So we've become a lot more sensitive around those things. But to your point, 5 years is the maximum that we would expect to have to do this. There are many that we think will transition much faster, but we need to have those conversations and come back with real information as opposed to what our projections essentially.
Okay, and my final question is about, so we have a pot of money that right now is attached to the organization regarding the subsidy. That pot, as Keith described it, is now attached to the individual, or the kid. That pot of money, if one year there's and I'm inventing numbers here, I think the number was 6,300 kids that are getting it. If next year it's 7,000, 8,000, or if it drops at 5,000, do we cap the amount? Like, could someone, what I'm asking is, could someone be eligible for the subsidy in terms of the criteria we're setting, but not actually receiving it?
Absolutely, and that's happening now. So yes, we will maximize the number of subsidies to 6,300, but that's why we have a wait list, is because we're either at the max of financing. The current system is inefficient from the perspective it's very hard to find where the unused dollars are. Now we will know exactly how much it is, and we will be controlling the expenditures on that end.
So could we, based on the various comments, could we ask for you, when you come back with the follow-up or how we're doing next year, to give us the other side of this, whereas why isn't the private sector fulfilling the backlog on the other side of things? We're not hearing from them today, and it's intriguing because there's quite a sector on the Quebec side that's fulfilling that, and I know that some wards might be showing it, but it might be showing some gains. But it'd be interesting, why is there a waiting list? I think there's a nanny industry, there's a couple of pieces, but there's some families that year after year are not eligible for the subsidy, and it's taking mom or dad off their works. They're not going back to work because it's too expensive. So there's got to be something here that I'm not saying it's the city's responsibility, I want to be clear on that, but there's got to be a better understanding why that portion of the parents or the kids aren't creating a sector.
The types of information, keep in mind, you went through with early learning, which we're just coming out of, in my view, paralyzed the entire system. And whether you're a not-for-profit provider or whether you're a for-profit provider, very difficult to determine, are you actually going to have children to serve? This created a great deal of uncertainty. It also meant that historically, where the dollars for childcare is the most optimal, we do the city, is for 4- and 5-year-olds. The younger age groups are very much more costly to serve, and what we'll see is that while there may be a waiting list for service, once fees get beyond a certain point per day, parents don't accept that service. So that's going to be the balance that the province will have to achieve between what now the federal government policy around dollars going to parents, the provincial policy in terms of dollars to subsidize the industry, is at what point do parents choose licensed childcare? And certainly you mentioned Quebec. Once you get to a certain threshold of cost, the demand and parents placing, it's almost automatic. They will choose that and make that choice. Once fees get beyond a certain point, they will make other choices in terms of care.
Merci.
Thank you, Councillor Fleury. Councillor Kakish, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Just had a couple of questions. We heard from one of the social service providers that was here about the lack of stability or information about the future and how this will sort of evolve. And I think you said in that 5-year plan, the next 2 years are sort of safe for most in terms of the funding. So just more specifically in terms of that timeline over the 5 years, so are we taking the next 2 years to figure out those details?
Within the next few months, those agencies will know exactly how this rolls out for them specifically. It's different agency by agency based on, you have 3 moving parts at all times: the fees they charge parents, the wages they pay, and their cost structure. And then you have the 4th, which is how much government funding per space are they getting. So that varies on virtually every single program right now based on historic funding. We're going to meet with all of those agencies, be very clear, start working towards them with respect to a plan in order to help them with the first year. They don't see any change, and they don't see any change in 2016. That obviously is going to help with that stability that we want to achieve. As we said, programs are under a certain degree of duress, In addition, we're recommending that should a program that would be eligible for more government funding in the future find that it's got some short-term and very immediate pressures, we have some emergency funding to flow. It's all going to be based on them developing their own viability and sustainability program going forward.
Okay, so we're working with our stakeholders, obviously, on our own timelines, or are we mandated by the province to come to some sort of resolution?
We are mandated to, what we're saying to the province is, you have basically directed that the funding is to be put into this type of formula approach. What we've said to them is we're essentially going to do it over 5 years. We're not going to go out and change immediately to what the province is asking. We're going to do this over 5 years. We're going to help our agencies transition during that period. And in addition to that, we are going to bring back the types of information in a much clearer way in terms of what's it actually cost for a space in the city, how much government funding per space goes into it, all of those elements. And then look at what additional funding is required. We did speak earlier about key priorities here around Aboriginal, Head Start, Francophone, special needs. Those are municipal priorities where we're actually putting 100% municipal dollars into those programs, and to clarify those ongoing commitments to those areas, because the province doesn't fund them, but they provide key areas that are essential to the city.
And how optimistic are you in terms of the forecast of the future and the next 3 years beyond the next two? Because, you know, we don't have a lot of speakers here today. We've heard from a couple of delegations, but I'm assuming that's because they have some stability in the near future. But beyond that, what is your forecast? What are the impacts?
Essentially, when we developed this plan, is we took an approach which said, take a worst-case scenario of absolutely no increase in inflation or otherwise in terms of the total amount of government funding per space coming in to support the industry. We know we can make it through the next 5 years. I don't think it's realistic to say that the province won't provide some additional funding. I think in order to achieve the objectives it has set in terms of base wages around $26.27 as a base wage, they're going to have to put more dollars into the subsidy and start bringing that up. This will become a lot more transparent to them once we've done this. I think if you want to achieve those objectives, that's how you're going to achieve it. We cannot predict, for example, what is going to be the impact, if any, of moving from $100 to $160 a month from the federal child care subsidy program. Will that actually help more parents to fund and go into this? Hard to say. Our best prediction is that we, from a municipal perspective, can backstop and do this over 5 years. As we continue to work and I think to some extent press the province to assume its responsibility, and we act as their service agent, which is essentially what our responsibility should be, as opposed to being the funder and trying to make all of the things happen that we need to happen. Childcare in our community, Toronto and a few others, is, in this community in particular, the makeup of our workforce, it is a critical service, and the demand is very high for it here, and we think if the provincial policies are related to including that stability and so on, that investment needs to come.
One of the points that I think it was Mr. Cullen raised during his presentation was about collaboration with the school boards, and I think you touched on that a bit as well when Councillor McKinney asked her question. Why are we not taking a more proactive or collaborative approach with the school boards?
No disrespect to the speaker, but I think he's taking a lot of comments out of context and kind of making it up as goes along.
So what is the fact? What are the facts?
So in terms of, we do have a very collaborative approach with the school boards. The 4 members are on our stakeholder reference group. What we spoke to, what we do have is a very clear transition of children leaving from one system, moving into the other. Our comments, and particularly my comments, were related to the legislation, and this was during the draft legislation period where we were invited to comment. There wasn't a lot of time provided during that period by the province to allow us to take comments to municipal councils and for them to develop input into that legislation. We were objecting to that approach And in addition, while I can recognize that there are certain municipalities in the province who are actually directly providing the service on behalf with the school board, our school boards here did not request, nor do they want us providing their services. In other municipalities, they are doing that. The municipality is actually directly delivering all of the before and after school within the school system as well as outside of it. Our key feedback was we don't want to be held accountable to start delivering a whole bunch of new planning and delivery things without the funding. And our estimate, based on what other municipalities were doing and have engaged, is we would require an additional 30 staff in this particular area, which is unfunded by the province. So our comments are largely along not assuming responsibilities that the province isn't going to fund or that council isn't going to direct us to do. That was the basis of it. We do plan and work with the school boards with respect to this. Keep in mind, in addition, the province and the Ministry of Education funds the school boards directly to do their services, and they have their own elected trustees for making their own decisions as well with respect to that.
And you're saying in the municipalities where they are working together, it's more that the local school boards approached the municipalities?
The development of the legislation was very specific to two groups, had equal voice in this. One was the City of Toronto, and the other was AMO, which had one voice on behalf of all childcare. So the City of Toronto has specific issues, so a lot of the legislation, in our view, looking at it, was set up to largely address the needs and the desires of the City of Toronto. That's why a lot of the legislation says you may do something as opposed to you must do something. So there are a lot of options here in terms of it, which was set up largely on the basis of the interests of the City of Toronto versus what we felt were more clear legislation that we would have used in this particular jurisdiction. And again, we did raise concerns around this not coming for full disclosure or full discussion through municipal council so that they had the ability to say, yes, they wanted to take on those responsibilities, or no, they didn't. So in the absence of that, we responded that unless you're funding it, we don't believe that municipalities should be required to take on these types of new processes.
Okay, but we are talking to the local school boards and collaborating where and
Absolutely.
when possible.
We do this on a daily basis.
Okay.
This is all part of our system.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Kakish. Anyone else have any questions? Seeing none, I just wanted to wrap up, and a number of the questions related to what happens next, what about 5 years from now when this money runs out. And I think the reality is that we have given the province a bit of a soft landing by using $11.5 million out of our reserve accounts to create some time for modernization in the system and for the province to step up and take the rightful role. And I think the reality here is that many families in our community are two-income families. Both parents are working. And if parents are going to work, they need to know that their children are properly taken care of, and they need those child care spaces. And there is a threshold. There's a threshold of what they can afford to pay. And what the province did when they moved the 4- and 5-year-olds into the school system is they really took the profit center out of this thing. They took the most profitable, because the ratios were lower for 4- and 5-year-olds, and moved them into the school system and left a system from 0 to 3.8 years old, which are by far the most expensive children to service, and especially the babies and the young ones where the ratios are really low. So financially, it's not working that well, and that's why we saw some closures. The reality is there's not enough money in the system. That's the reality, and what we need to do is convince the province that they need to take their rightful role. They have the responsibility for childcare in this province. They need to take their rightful role, and they need to step up to the plate, and they need to deliver, and they need to put more money in the system. And, we can look to modernization, and of course I think the childcare community will look to modernization, and there are some opportunities, and they will take those opportunities. But at the end of the day, there's not enough money, and it will drive some parents out of the workforce if they can't get childcare that they can afford. And so I think it really is incumbent upon us to take this time. I think we're doing the right thing, creating a bit of a buffer time to get this right, but I think we are going to need a strategy. We're probably going to need to work with AMO and other organizations to figure out how we're going to get the province to recognize that this system needs more money, and that's just a fact. So having said that, carried on the recommendations? Carried. Thank you. So now we'll turn to item number 7, which is harmonization of recreation fees. See if he's going to do. Morning, Mr. Chenier. Do you have a presentation?
Yes, Madam Chair, a very short one. I know you've had a long item prior to this. So we're before you this morning to talk about harmonization of fees, recreation fees. This is nothing new. City Council first turned its mind to the harmonization of recreation fees in 2002, right after amalgamation, because we inherited a smorgasbord of former municipalities' programs and fees, which were all different, both in terms of fees, program descriptions, program content. So in 2002, we did get authority from Council to begin harmonization of fees, and the easiest parts to do at that point were to harmonize programs that had essentially the same content. And so if you think of things like swimming lessons or skating lessons that we largely buy from outside providers, Red Cross, Life Saving Society, it was quite easy to offer a harmonized menu and a harmonized range of fees across there. What was left outstanding from that was essentially the local community-based programs that you see in recreation centers, things like registered fitness programs, kids sports programs, summer camps, after-school programming, that kind of thing. And at that time, Council actually delegated to the GM of Parks and Recreation some latitude of delegated authority to begin harmonizing those. Fast forward to 2007, the Auditor General did an audit of Parks Recreation at that time and came up with quite a few recommendations, but among them was two or three recommendations that were very specific to the topic at hand today. One was to develop a consistent approach to determining our fees, to develop a consistent approach to determining cost recovery, and to look at harmonizing the services that we offer across the geography of Ottawa in recreation facilities. 2007 also gave us the fiscal framework approved by Council that provided direction on setting fees and determining cost recovery, not just for recreation, but for a whole variety of fees across the corporation. Brings us to today, and we have been working on this. One of the things that slowed down harmonization of fees was the last term of Council's freeze of recreation fees. So from 2011 to 2014, we did not have any increases in recreation fees. That made it virtually impossible to do any fee adjustments up or down, because that was perceived as straying away from Council's directive to leave the fees where they were. And so we, of course, respected that and started to do some work on harmonizing content, looking at content, and perfecting some of the cost recovery formulas that we were working on. There are, as you can see from the slide, our registered programs are about a $23 million business, and we have about 37,000 different product codes within our class system for registration. So it's a rather massive undertaking to harmonize it all. Thankfully, about 2/3 of it falls in the category that I was speaking about already, which was essentially aquatics that are all the same, those kinds of things, which leaves us about 10,000 programs that we want to focus on to harmonize in the next 2 or 3 years during this term of council. And so we had a bit of this discussion leading up to the 2015 budget. I know I spoke to the chair and to the vice chair on a few occasions about this. The impact of starting to add cost of living to our fees, was that enough to compensate or adjust for the 4 years of not having those adjustments, and identified quite clearly that it wasn't. Within a 2% increase provision by council, there's only limited ability to adjust, both in terms of getting us back to cost recovery on some of the programs, and in terms of harmonizing some down and some up, so that we have across the city an even fairer and even pricing across the city. And so as part of that, we undertook to come back after budget, that's what this report is about, to look at a process for harmonization and to put a bit of a sandbox around how we would do that so that it did not impact in a negative way on clients right away, where we had to make significant adjustments. So part of this report does recommend a couple of things. One, that this whole exercise not cost the department or the city anything in terms of losing revenues, and so we would harmonize within our existing revenue targets set by council as part of the budget. And secondly, we would put some limits on how much fees could increase in any given year for a group of clients in a certain program, capping that at either 10% of the existing fee or $20. And the $20 is there because in some cases, even a 15 or 20% increase is a very small increase because the program fee itself is rather low. So that was the approach there, and that's what you see in front of you today. We provided you with an example, and it's probably appropriate. We didn't know we would be discussing childcare would also be on the agenda today, but this is the recreation alternative to childcare, which is essentially our supervisory program for after schools that are offered in recreation facilities. It isn't an alternative for those that have very specific needs. And so the example that you see here, we have about 51 programs across the city. They're not all shown there, and 41 different fees that apply to these programs. So as you can see, depending on where you go in the city and the type of program that you're asking about, you're going to get a different answer in terms of price, although essentially the program itself is the same, that children come to the center after school, either provide and are provided with a variety of activities until their parents pick them up. And so what we're looking at here, and you'll see this example also provides an example where some of the price differential can be fixed in the first phase, in the first year of fee adjustments, while others, because they are either way below or way above, will require 1 or 2 or 3 years to adjust them to the level. It's not on here, but the overall impact for the worst case scenario here, which I believe is the Huntley Centennial Building, or at least one of them, the overall monthly impact is about $11 change in price for somebody registering in these programs. And so we would be keeping it within a reasonable increase, an impact on parents. The whole point of this, of course, is to provide an equal playing field for those that register in our programs across the city in all programs. We're not there now. It would certainly, since we've moved to online promotion of our programming, clients who register in programs are able to see what programs we offer all across the city, and one of the common inquiries that we get and that some councillors also receive through their offices is, why is such a certain program this much at the Sportsplex and this much at Ray Friel? And often the only explanation for that is historical, based on the way the program is originally started and then was inflated with cost of living throughout the years when those were provided, but it hasn't really changed since. So part of this is meant to adjust that. It's meant to apply a standard formula to pricing to determine the cost recovery point, and we've refined that because a lot has changed over the years. There are now other things to consider, new certification costs that go into it, new legislated training requirements that are required, all of which have an influence on cost. And of course, where council has decided that we are going to subsidize programs, that it's applied uniformly. An adjunct to that would, of course, be outside sources of funding to our programs, whether they be provincial grants, sponsorships, the Canadian Tire Jumpstart program, for example. Those external sources of funding would be reflected fairly and evenly all across the city. And of course, we want to minimize the impact of price change on clients, and so that's why we're recommending, after discussion, that this be phased in over a period that's required so that folks are not unduly impacted by that. Part of the benefits of this, obviously the fairness piece is important, but it also, this will give us the ability to not only make sure that the prices are the same, but that we start to standardize our program descriptions. Often a question we get is, what is the difference between your basketball level 1, your basketball above the hoops level 1, and your basketball for kids program? Often they're essentially the same and could all be called the same thing and should have the program description, but right now they're not because they all have a different price. This is an opportunity to standardize that and facilitate the shopping for the service that you need, because it will reduce the number of program descriptions that you see. It will also allow us to become a little bit more focused on how we brand these programs, because right now, especially in the community-based programs, there are so many choices that appropriate branding becomes very difficult for us to achieve. And then the last thing, which is perhaps a lesser consideration because it's more internally focused, is the administration of pricing. Right now, with 37,000 product codes, whenever council or another influence comes along to change our prices or our program descriptions, making those changes is massive. Once we move to a standardized price, then there are efficiencies in our ability to more quickly respond to this and be a little bit more nimble with those things. And lastly, only because one of the councillors asked me on this proposes phases, 3 phases of implementation. And that's largely because this implementation of this has to follow our programming seasons. For example, we are in the midst of registering for our summer camps for this coming summer now, and therefore we would not try to harmonize summer programs for 2015. You will see that they are in for 2016. Likewise, we are about to finalize our fall-winter brochure for next year, and again, there are a lot of programs in there that we won't be able to harmonize in time. So we've identified programs that we think we could harmonize in a phase 1, which upon council approval we would move to, but we're also, looking for approval to harmonize in a second phase, which will likely start in the next programming cycle, which will make a lot more sense, will be less disruptive to the market. So I've tried to keep it as concise as possible, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you. And there are some questions, starting with Councillor Egley.
Thank you, Dan. I think this, you and I have talked about this on a number of occasions, and I think it's long overdue that we harmonize it across the city and everybody's treated in the same way. Just a couple of quick questions. Will individual counselors be getting advance notice of which programs in their particular communities or wards are going to see an increase or a decrease so that we can be better prepared to respond to residents?
Councillor, we do have the ability to do that. I forgot to introduce Jamie Waitman is the project lead on this, and in fact for today she had prepared the breakdown by ward for the after-school programming. So we do have that ability, and if councillors so wish, we can certainly inform them of the impact of changes in their wards.
Well, I can't speak for everybody. This councillor certainly wishes to have that so that we can be better prepared. The other question I have is, again, looking at the example that you set out for the after-school programs. So, for example, at the Sportsplex in my ward, the fee is currently $324, and you're recommending $325. So there's really essentially no change there, 0% change. But in certain cases, it's going to, I think, take up to 3 years to get it up to what we've decided is the right amount. At the same time, though, we've given you authority to do cost of living increases. So are the people in my ward that are getting access to the after-school program at $324, are they going to see cost of living increases over the next 3 years? So that by the time, for example, Henry Larson catches up at $325, the people in my ward are going to be paying $324 plus 2% plus 2% plus 2%. Or are we going to freeze the ones that are currently at the correct amount until everybody catches up and then apply the rate freeze, which seems to me to be the fairer approach?
Councillor, through you, Chair. The correct amount that you see here, $325, is for 2015. So it's been adjusted with the 2% the Council just approved as part of the 2015 budget. If for next year a particular group needs to come down, then obviously we would not increase them, then decrease them again. So we will make sure that we rationalize how we apply any future economic increases that council may approve through next year's budget or the year after, so that we're not doing, add 2, take away 3, or those kinds of things.
I guess what I'm saying is if we apply the increases across the board, the facilities that are charging the right amount are always going to be charging more than the ones that are catching up over the next 2 or 3 years. And to me, that if we're harmonizing, we're harmonizing.
And we need to continue we hope to continue to increase by an inflationary increase every year, because of course our costs this is a picture of 2015 and our cost recovery, what we need for cost recovery in 2015. But as you can anticipate, there will be our largest input into these programs are wages, and there is likely to be a wage adjustment to the part-time collective bargaining, which we will then need to reflect into next year, as well as hopefully a fee increase, and then we'll look at what the proper adjustment is in terms of the harmonization.
No, I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying, though, is if, again, so this is 2015, so if we have, say we have the next 2 years, we have 2% increases for cost of living. So then the people getting the service at the Sportsplex are paying $324 plus 2% plus another 2%. And I don't know what that number is going to work out to, but in that same period of time at Henry Larson, they're only going to be getting up to the $325 at that point after.
Yes.
So to me, you're still going to have an inequality in the system. You're still going to have certain facilities where people are going to be paying for more for the same service. So what I'm suggesting, and I support what you're trying to do here, absolutely, and I'll support it today, but what I would like to see before we get to council is maybe you can give us give all council some indication of what the impact would be if you froze the people at what we're saying are the current appropriate amounts, so that this inequality, even if fueled just by the cost of living increase, does not perpetuate. Or 10 years from now, we're going to be in the same situation, going to be sitting in front of us again, maybe not me, but in front of council and saying, we have this certain community centers you're paying X and certain you're paying Y. So I think we have to find a way to level the field. So if you could have something
Agreed.
Before council.
Get Jamie and her team to work on that before council, and we'll have something
again,
for you.
I support what you're doing, and I will support it today, but I'd like to see that impact report, if that's what you can call it, prior to the final vote of council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Egli. You make an excellent point. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly support the staff recommendation before us. I think it is needed, and I was just chatting with Councillor Shirelli about the need to perhaps harmonize your 37,000 product codes. Seems like a lot, and maybe we can whittle that down a bit. And there's one thing to harmonize the fees, but also, as I've spoken with the general manager, the need to ensure that the costs of running our various programs are actually matched by the revenues brought into it. And certainly during the budget discussions learned that in some cases we're not running programs on a cost recovery basis, that we are running programs at a loss. And certainly in addition to my interest in harmonizing fees, I'm as interested in ensuring that when the city runs programs, we are not doing it at a loss, that we're doing our best over the next few years to make sure that we can acquire revenues that match costs. My last comment is somewhat tongue-in-cheek because, well, again, the focus of this report is based on harmonizing fees to ensure that all residents, regardless of where they attend the course, pay basically the same. We can't say that the experience in all of our community centers is the same. And as the general manager knows, I've been advocating to have renovation and repair work done at the Alexander Community Center. And I would argue that there are community centers in our city that have been either recently built or recently renovated that are very good structures, are very good buildings, and the experience is great on many levels. And there are other community centers where they need some tender, loving care. And we know that's very expensive. I'm not living in a dream world here, but all this to say that if we're worried about harmonizing fees to make sure there's equity and fairness, we need to ensure that our community centers are being provided the care and renovation and repairs that they need over time to ensure that communities that are new and have brand new community centers and community centers that exist in more mature neighborhoods are offering their residents the same type of experience. So that is equally important to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had two questions. The first actually builds on Councillor Brockington's question about cost recovery, but I think I have a slightly different view on it, which is I understand and support the idea of recreational programming being cost neutral or paying for itself. But one of the lines on page 3 suggested that every individual program would need to have direct cost recovery. And I guess I wouldn't support that in the sense of if I'm a general manager of a community center, and I run a bunch of programs that are making money, but I'm trying to do more early childhood programs, so I run a parent and taught music program, and at one point cost recovery requires 8 children and I have 7 registered, but it's part of a long-term plan to build up that clientele. I think want to make sure that we're empowering the general manager to say we're going to run this with 7 clients even though we're going to lose $50 because it's part of a long-term vision to build up this particular area. So I wanted to make sure that we did have that flexibility to run individual programs even if one term of 3 they were losing a few dollars, because I think ultimately we want to make sure that we're responding to the individual needs and vision and plans of individual centers. So maybe you can just clarify that issue of cost recovery.
Through you, Madam Chair, absolutely. That is the intent. Part of the same Auditor General review of the department that I mentioned, he suggested that we manage our finances and revenues within community centers and recreation facilities to the bottom line of each facility. And that's very much the approach that is taken, so that we do have programs that are priced currently and that will continue to be to make a little bit of money, because the market rate, we are in a competitive market, and the market rate will bear it, and we're thinking about things like adult fitness, spinning classes, those kinds of things. And on the other hand, we also know that things like youth drop-ins or training programs, those kinds of things often require a subsidy. So there is an ability, it is the intent to build that in, because it's already there. And as I mentioned, in a lot of cases, Council has already approved the delegated authority for us to do that kind of cross-program subsidization, and the intent is to continue. However, the intent is also to be able to, and this was an Auditor General recommendation as well, to be able to identify when we're doing that and where we're doing it, so that it isn't being done haphazardly and that we're able to identify it.
Okay, thank you. And my second and final question, building a little bit on Councillor Eglai's question about wanting to get facility-specific information, and I think that, for my part, would be very, very useful, just gets to the issue of the annual adjustment. I, too, support this initiative, but just thinking about, for instance, in my ward, the St. Laurent complex, which services a lot of low-income residents in my ward and Councillor Fleury's ward, I mean, I guess the only thing that I'm thinking about is in a situation where you have a lot of low-income families registered for a particular program, if in that case they're on the low end, and harmonization is going to mean a $20 increase over 3 years, and we've only increased the subsidy by $5 a year, which is not even what does that hit the 2%? Yeah, I mean, it's roughly 2%, but it wouldn't get to, obviously, the delta between a current program cost and a future one. I'm just wondering, I don't know yet if that's a problem, but if it is, would there be a way of addressing that, or do we have to wait till next year's budget to increase the subsidy?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. A couple of things. Firstly, and I didn't identify this up front, but it is part of our intent, is that we will not be targeting programs that are primarily serving vulnerable populations, those economically disadvantaged in our various facilities. This is really aimed at the mainstream programming in the first attempt, the cross-city mainstream programming. The second thing is, it would be our hope that this year we got an increase in the subsidy from 165 to 170. We were hoping to 180, but with the budget being as tight as it was, that wasn't possible. It is our intent to come back with a request to further increase that and to look at other ways to start to supplement programming through other sponsorships. So we are mindful that this could have an impact, especially where the increase is over the 2%, and we'll be watching that to make sure that the programs that we change are, at least in the short term, until we can put other strategies in place unduly impacting certain facilities.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Nussbaum. Anyone else? So carried on the report. Thank you. Any notices of motion? Inquiries? Adjourned. Thank you.